We're almost home now, at the beginning of the 20th century, our century, when the chickens hatched in earlier times come home to roost, making the world, and Europe within it, smaller, scarier, and more expectant. The most spectacular of the century's phenomena was what I like to call the Second 30 Years' War, from 1914 to 1945. During that period, 2 world wars killed more Europeans than any of the great conflicts of the past ever did. They left economies in ruins. They left millions of Europeans subject to totalitarian rule. Before 1914, Europe had been the center of the world, dominant and dynamic. After 1945, it was reduced to its basic physical dimensions, a medium-sized peninsula at the western end of Asia. Eventually, much of it would recover. It would even surpass its former prosperity, but it would never again regain the preponderant role that it had so long played in world politics. In the years before the First World War, many people felt a catastrophe was inevitable, but they could not imagine what it would be like. We have all known moments like this, long nightmare moments when you know something vague but terrible is about to happen, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. As early as 1901, Winston Churchill, then just 27 and newly elected to Parliament, told the House of Commons that a European war can only end in the ruin of the vanquished and the scarcely less fatal commercial dislocation and exhaustion of the conquerors. Churchill lived to see his prediction come true not once, but twice. The fact is that by 1914, most of the European powers had become less afraid to fight than not to fight. Germany and Austria especially felt the balance of power was swinging against them. Once they mobilized for war, the others followed in a deadly avalanche. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, a sensible, unemotional man, looked at the dusk that gathered outside his office window and observed, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." Sensible men were not much in evidence then. They seldom are. They cheered the war in all the great cities, London, Paris, Berlin. Young people welcomed it as an exciting diversion. The poet Rupert Brooke thanked the God who matched him with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping. And so the Great War began. Rupert Brooke had his fun and died. So did other millions. Those who did not die rotted and shivered in the trenches or lived to suffer long years with amputated limbs or gassed lungs. The chief contestants on one side were the British, French, and Russians, joined in 1915 by the Italians and in 1917 by the Americans, along with several smaller nations. Fighting on the other side were Germans and Austrians, along with the Turks and Bulgarians. They gained an early advantage, but then bogged down in a deadly war of attrition that went on and on until one side was hungrier and more exhausted than the other. Germany accepted the stringent terms of the armistice in the fall of 1918. Everyone agreed there had never been a war like this one and that the world could never again bear such a toll. Over 8 million Europeans, perhaps 10 million in all, died on the battlefields. Arch enemies, Germany and France, each sacrificed at least 16% of their male populations. And if that were not enough, a vast influenza epidemic in 1918 and 19 swept through a cold, hungry, weakened world, killing 2 or 3 times as many people as the war had done. After the corpses had been buried, the peace negotiations could begin. Unfortunately, they prepared the ground not for a just and lasting peace as promised, but, as the economist John Maynard Keynes wrote, for another just and lasting war. President Woodrow Wilson led the American delegation. American loans and supplies had kept France and Britain going during the war. American intervention finally helped to win it. But at the negotiations in Paris, Wilson could not convince his allies to be more magnanimous in peace than the Germans had been in war. As a basis for a fair peace, Wilson had devised 14 points. Clemenceau, the French premier, snidely commented that even the good Lord needed only 10 commandments. As the other negotiators whittled away his points, Wilson became obsessed with the 14th and last, which called for a League of Nations that could afford mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. But once back home, Wilson collapsed from nervous exhaustion, then suffered a stroke. It left the United States to be governed by a sick and mentally impaired president, and it ensured that Americans would feel the peace eventually concluded was not their peace. They became increasingly isolationist and turned their backs on Europe, which had a serious effect on the world balance of power. In Geneva, the new League of Nations set up shop in 1920. There, the disarray of the European democracies became painfully obvious. In the League Assembly, high ideals were treated as realities, providing the ex-allies with excuses for avoiding hard issues and providing their enemies with excuses for fudging the issues. The peace settlement was clearly too harsh for the Germans to accept, too soft to keep them down for long. So it was a nervous time. Europe was unsettled, its map dramatically altered. Under the strain of war, 4 empires had crumbled. The Russian first, then the Austrian, the Ottoman, and the German. When the empires collapsed, the people took to the streets. It was a perfect opportunity for a dozen nationalities from Albania to Finland to fight for national independence or reunification with their brethren. Minor wars were fought all over Europe. Greeks fought Turks, Hungarians fought Romanians, the Poles fought everybody, and most Central and East Europeans fought each other in civil wars as well. In Russia, The most significant of these wars had taken place in 1917 as two successful revolutions brought a small faction of social democrats into power, the Bolshevik communists led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. In 1917, the Russian peasant armies were disintegrating on the Eastern Front, no match for the German war machine. Lenin and the Bolsheviks bought time by signing a peace in the city of Brest-Litovsk and giving up large parts of Western Russia to Germany. They won popular support by opting for peace at all costs. They promised land to the peasants, better conditions to industrial workers. This got them through several difficult years of civil and foreign war and allowed them to settle firmly into power. Bolshevism in Russia looked like the illegitimate offspring of Karl Marx and Ivan the Terrible. One of its distinctive marks was the widespread use of bureaucratization and of terror against the people. Lenin's secret police, a crucial element of the regime, murdered 1,000 times as many people as the Tsar's police had done. As Joseph Stalin, Lenin's successor, remarked, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." Under Stalin, about 10 million peasants were tortured and murdered in the late 1920s and 30s, killed when Russia proceeded to collectivize agriculture and prohibit family farms, an operation that also exiled or transported millions more. Collectivization has been called the most warlike operation ever conducted by a state against its own people. But this institutionalization of terror did not affect Russia alone. Communist or not, Russia is part of Europe. It's a part of the world power system. And now that Russia had been taken over by a gang hostile to the West, its former allies, Britain and France, could no longer play Russia against the Germans. And when equally disturbing men came to power, first in Italy and then in Germany, the democracies felt increasingly isolated. They could ill afford to make more enemies. Let's look at Italy first. Italy had been an ally of Britain and France in the war, but it was the least victorious of the victors. The war left a heritage of social disorder, economic anarchy, bitter frustration. The country's solution was to combine in an explosive mixture the two greatest dynamic forces of the 19th century, nationalism and socialism. In 1922, Benito Mussolini, socialist and war veteran, came to power by violence and intimidation. He adopted as the emblem of his movement the fasces, which magistrates of ancient Rome had carried as an emblem of their authority and of the unity of the state. Mussolini improved the railroads. He built a large aircraft industry and drained the mosquito-infested Pontine marshes outside Rome. But much of what he did was for show. None of the country's real problems disappeared. Yet, compared to Russian misery or the West's spinelessness, Mussolini's right-wing dictatorship called fascism looked like a success. One of those whom Mussolini impressed was going to surpass him, Adolf Hitler, another demagogue and national socialist who soared to power on the wings of crisis. The Germany of the later 20s and early 30s was a disaster area. Every European country finished the First World War with its economy in tatters, but Germany's was worst. Soaring inflation made it catastrophic. Savers lost everything they had. The solid middle classes never recovered. From this point on, Germany was full of people who had nothing to lose. In 1932, during the height or perhaps the depth of the Great Depression, unemployment reached 43%. By that time, the Nazis were the second largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. The communists were third. It was natural that the young and desperate, or indeed the young and idealistic, many of them students, should place their hope in Nazism with its flaming patriotism. The old order had proved its failure in the economic shipwreck of the Depression, as well as in the slaughter of the Great War. And the students were not alone. 3 years after the Nazis took over in 1933, Germany was the only industrial power to have virtually full employment. No wonder the Germans were enthusiastic about Hitler and did not ask too many questions. And so it was the losers of the First World War who dominated the politics of the 20s and 30s, while the winners could neither intimidate them nor placate them, although they tried both. Russia was beyond the pale. America remained huffily isolationist, and Britain and France drifted from squabbling to indecision to appeasement, which is when you throw your friends to the wolves, hoping the wolves will be sated before they get to you. Britain and France then drifted from appeasement into desperation, largely because they couldn't make up their minds what would be the least bad solution among a number of terrible solutions. It's easy to blame them in retrospect. I blamed them at the time. But their problems were great. And the greatest was that many of their citizens felt they had a lot to lose if they rocked the boat, while their enemies felt they had a lot to gain by rocking ever harder. France, remember, had lost 16% of its male population, and a lot more were disabled. By 1936, the French had more people over 60 than any other country. This was reflected in their conservatism and in their desperate desire to avoid a conflict. In Britain, unemployment and labor unrest were endemic. The industrial working class was first angered and then humiliated by the failure of its general strike in 1926. They were brought even lower by the Depression. The British Empire came out of the war larger than ever, but this only meant that the sun never set upon its problems. No one in liberal Britain could decide just how illiberal it could afford to be in maintaining its power over its colonies. The country's intellectual elite, which had been deeply disillusioned by the war, now combined a rejection of nationalism with hedonism. E.M. Forster, the novelist, remarked that if he had to choose between betraying his country and betraying a friend, he hoped he would have the guts to betray his country. So this was a time when both communism and fascism provided new flags to inspire and rally, and many of the best and brightest, as well as the brutish and shallow, turned to them between the wars. There was bound to be a clash between the dictators who knew or thought they knew what they wanted, and the liberal democracies rent by self-criticism and doubt, and it was an uneven match. In March 1933, the first concentration camp opened at Dachau near Munich, 2 months after Hitler came to power. 3 months later, the leader of Britain's Labour Party, George Lansbury, declared, "I would close every recruiting station, disband the army and disband the air force. I would abolish the whole deadly equipment of war and say to the world, do your worst." Well, the world was doing its worst. So Germany rebuilt its army, and men of goodwill continued to act impartially between the fire brigade and the fire. Time was running out. In Spain, General Francisco Franco led right-wing rebels against a legally elected left-wing government in 1936. The rebels were helped by the Germans and Italians. The Spanish government was supported by France and Russia. But French aid was too little too late, and the Russians were chiefly interested in helping themselves, so fascist aid to Franco proved vastly more effective and more deadly. In April 1937, the German Air Force lent a hand by bombing the town of Guernica. The raid left 1,000 inhabitants dead and the town in rubble. It had a profound effect on European diplomacy, for scenes of destruction on this scale fanned Europe's fears of mass bombing. Pablo Picasso then immortalized the raid in a painting he did for the 1937 World's Fair. So the horror of Guernica added a new dimension to the general dread of war and bolstered the democracy's reluctance to risk anything of the sort. When Hitler illegally reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, when he illegally annexed Austria and rode triumphantly through the streets of Vienna, the fear of war persuaded the Allies to do nothing. Then, in September 1938, Hitler pushed even further, demanding a piece of Czechoslovakia. He mobilized his army on the Czech border. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, was appalled.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing.
You can understand how relieved Chamberlain would be when he managed to avert war by going to Munich and making a deal with Hitler. In the process, he helped give away Czechoslovakia's western borderlands and render her defenseless. He called that peace with honor. Winston Churchill was more to the point when he told the House of Commons that it had sustained a defeat without having to fight a war. And yet, in spite of German and Italian aggression, most Western statesmen in the 1930s persisted in treating fascist leaders not as ruthless hoodlums indifferent to rules, but as politicians very much like themselves. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, observed rather wistfully that the world would have been a much better place and easier to manage if Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini had been to Oxford. The next best thing, it seemed, was to pretend they had. But wolves are wolves, even if you choose to pretend that they're chickens. And the hunger of the wolves wasn't going to be appeased so easily, as we shall see in our next program.